Dr. O'Connell, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. So you argue that the reality of our past might just have, or cast a shadow on Heritage Day celebrations if we choose to ignore it. Let's start with the Cape Flats, which is what you looked at, and its history of how it came about.
Thank you very much, firstly, for having me on the show. In as much as Heritage Day is a day of celebration for all sorts of reasons, I think we'll be doing ourselves a disservice to celebrate on the one hand and ignore the lived realities of life for so many who are picking up the pieces of lives of dispossession. And I look at the Cape Flats, for example, which really was established as a place for coloured and black folk as a result of forced removals due to the Group Areas Act of 1950. So places like Mitchell's Plain, Hanover Park, Pontyville, Lavendale, and even Atlantis out on the west coast become these communities of people who are thrown together from all places across Cape Town, and they're forced to exist and to try and make a living in a sandy, dangerous place, and that's held hostage to winter floods and summer fires and so forth, without having any real space to understand and to articulate how it is that they come to be in this place. So whilst we can have our braais and we can joke around that which brings us together as colourful South Africans, sitting right on the edge of our seats and really in some places a couple of kilometres away from where we live, are people crammed together in shacks without running water, without ablution facilities. And I cannot see how we, especially at this moment during this pandemic, which has called for another way of being and seeing things, how we can simply whitewash that reality away.
Some would very well argue that the fight for freedom in South Africa was the fight to get the land back, and the land restitution process has been quite slow, if you will. What does that mean for these people who are left with this trauma and having to deal with this on their own?
I think there's a real gap that exists for those of us interested in the land question. I agree that the return of land or cash is a necessary intervention, one that has been slowed up perhaps by bureaucracy, by low budgets, perhaps by money siphoned off to state capture and corruption. But there's been very little space for memory work around the trauma of evictions to be thought about and played out. And often it's not only the initially dispossessed, the grandparents and the great-grandparents who were kicked out of Harfield Village or Constantia or Newlands who carry these memories. It's often the intergenerational trauma that is visited on their children and their grandchildren that plays out in all kinds of ways, socio and economic as well as on the psyche. So we're sitting with a deeply traumatized nation. If we understand that up to 10 million people were estimated to have been forcibly removed as a result of the Group Areas Act, we understand that a large portion of South Africa's population bears these traces. So it is in everybody's interest, not only those who were dispossessed, but it is in the interest of the well-heeled, the interest of the privileged, to ensure that we can emerge as a healthy nation and form healthy communities so that in 25 years' time, or if another crisis hits, we are better equipped to deal with this.
This particular crisis required social distancing, it required sanitation, it required a lot of things which some, for us it's basic and you take for granted on a daily basis. Looking at the Cape Flats and the work that you did here, we oftentimes read newspaper headlines or we watch the news and we think we have an idea of what it's like to actually live there. What kind of an environment are we actually talking about here?
We are talking about an environment in which it is impossible to socially isolate. People are crammed into shacks, they're living cheek by jowl. Running water is a scarcity. Being able to buy masks or have them washed is difficult. We have people crowding into taxis so they can be domestic workers and gardeners in the well-heeled suburbs, and they are most at risk. So this idea of keeping 2 meters away from somebody, even with the best will and intention in the world, becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible. And especially in Cape Town, we can walk on top of Table Mountain, and I always, when I overlook places like as Bishop's Court or Newlands or Constantia, it's absolutely silent from on top of the mountain, and I consider this white noise, this idea that everything is blocked out. And if you look below, this view from below the mountain, you see these gorgeous greenscapes of the southern suburbs, and indeed even the Atlantic seaboard. And out there in the distance, you see these shacks and houses crammed on top of one another. And I think if we start to understand that Cape Town, like many parts of South Africa, is made up of these divided enclaves, and it is difficult to understand it, or to put oneself in those shoes to understand what it is like to live and survive and celebrate on a daily basis.
That this has been going on for so long, do you have hope that something will give, and in another 10 years' time we will not be having this conversation, but rather we'll be having a conversation when we're saying, oh, that worked, oh, that happened, oh, great, check, check, check?
Well, I referred to a project that I did on South Africa's first successful land claim, which was in Elandskloof out in the Cederberg. So it was a well-established religious settlement that received the land back in 1996, farmland. Yet, barely 20-odd years later, when I visited Elandskloof, it is an area absolutely mired in poverty. And one would have thought that, given that this was South Africa's first successful land restitution case, that somebody surely would have gone back to evaluate and see the impact of the return of that land, and to learn lessons from the past. So I think this call and this Heritage Day, from me and for others interested in the land question, is to call on government to do the serious evaluatory work on this, on the land restitution program, and not only to assess in terms of the return of land or cash, but to understand the trauma and the ongoing violences that's attached to that forced removal, because we simply can't afford this question in another 10 years' time. We don't have that privilege anymore. It's gone.
Absolutely not. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Siona O'Connell from the University of Pretoria.